From a catastrophic train derailment in Ohio that some were calling Chernobyl 2.0, and a sugar explosion in Georgia that caused one of the worst industrial accidents in U.S. history, to Saddam Hussein's last-ditch effort to prevent the United States from landing on the beaches of Kuwait, and a greedy South Korean developer whose reckless building plans caused one of the deadliest collapses the world has ever seen. Here are 10 man-made disasters that could have been prevented. On December 11th of 2005, a massive explosion at the Buncefield Oil Depot rocked Hertfordshire, England. The blast was so powerful that it rattled houses 40 miles away. It was so loud that people in Holland heard it go boom. According to reports, more than 60 billion gallons of fuel burst into a ball of flames. The flames rose hundreds of feet into the sky, and the smoke clouds stretched for miles in every direction. The fire chief described their effort to fight the blaze as mounting a sustained attack. Londoners awoke to a massive explosion around 6 a.m. Older folks must have had flashbacks to World War II. Then, 2 smaller explosions followed about 20 minutes later. According to the British Geological Survey, the explosion clocked in as a 2.4 magnitude earthquake. Office buildings near the disaster had almost every window blown out. Thankfully, most of the employees hadn't arrived at work yet. Police were worried that the blast had caused structural damage to other buildings and began evacuating. So, what caused this massive blast? The Major Incident Investigation Board released its final report 6 years after the blast. They found that Tank 912 was being filled with petrol as usual. Employees used gauges on every tank to manually track the oil levels inside. An automatic switch would stop the flow when oil reached a certain level. You can think of the shutoff switch as a failsafe. Apparently, the manual gauge on Tank 912 was stuck and the shutoff switch was broken. The tank kept filling until it eventually overflowed and spilled petrol all over the ground. This caused a vapor cloud to form, igniting and blowing sky-high the entire thing. The fire lasted for 5 days. An oil company called Total UK was in charge of the depot. In 2009, they pleaded guilty to several health and safety breaches that led to the explosion. The courts determined that Total was responsible for the property damage to people's homes and businesses. We're talking upwards of £750 million, not including the cost of rebuilding the oil depot. Under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, Iraqi forces invaded and occupied Kuwait on August 2nd of 1990. Basically, Iraq owed Kuwait a bunch of oil money and Saddam didn't want to pay up. But when you mess with the world's oil supply, the United States will likely get involved. On January 16th of 1991, UN coalition forces launched the most intensive air attack in military history. They dropped over 88,000 tons of explosives on Saddam's army. About 10 days into the 42-day bombing campaign, people began noticing large amounts of oil flooding the Persian Gulf. Saddam expected the United States to land in Kuwait by sea, so he intentionally dumped 11 million barrels of crude oil into the Persian Gulf. They even dug trenches along the beaches and filled them with oil. About 6,000 barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf every day for the next 3 months. To make things worse, the Iraqis set 732 oil wells on fire as they retreated. The fires burnt about 6 million barrels a day. Videos taken by soldiers show the extremely apocalyptic scene of a desert landscape lit up by the light of burning oil wells. According to Stanford University, it was the largest oil spill in history. Cleanup wasn't easy since, there was a war happening in the background. Oil kept spilling out of contaminated areas for a year after the war. Over 430 miles of the Saudi Arabian coast were covered in black. Cleanup costs were estimated between $210 and $540 million. The entire ordeal was one of the largest acts of ecological terrorism the world has ever seen. In the 1970s, Seviso was a small suburban town in northern Italy, 10 miles north of Milan. About 17,000 people lived in the shadow of a chemical plant owned by ICMESA, an offshoot of the pharmaceutical titan Hoffmann La Roche. On July 10th of 1976, one of the plant buildings became dangerously hot. The temperature and pressure inside one of the tanks rose past the point of no return. While residents tended to their gardens, a silent bomb was getting ready to go off. The pressure release valve finally blew. A massive cloud of toxic gases loomed over the town. The Seviso tragedy was basically Italy's Chernobyl. The worst of the chemicals was 2378 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, commonly called TCDD or dioxin. This industrial byproduct is among the deadliest compounds in the world. It's known to cause cancer and severe reproductive effects similar to radiation exposure. You may also develop chloracne, a painful skin condition. About 37,000 people from Seviso and the surrounding areas were evacuated after the accident. Wildlife took the brunt of the damage. The government also ordered the emergency slaughter of farm animals to avoid human consumption of tainted products. By 1978, about 80,000 animals were killed. In 1983, Italian courts found 5 company officials guilty of criminal negligence. 3 of them appealed, and 2 served time in prison. Meanwhile, Roche had to pay $168 million in damages. On February 7th of 2008, an explosion near Savannah, Georgia led to one of the deadliest industrial disasters in U.S. history. You would think that something that big and deadly would involve lots of oil and gas, but this story is all about sugar. The explosion occurred at the Imperial Sugar Refinery northwest of Savannah. It claimed 14 lives and injured 38 others. 14 of those injuries included life-threatening burns. According to the official report, the blast was caused by a massive accumulation of combustible sugar dust that filled the packaging building. But what the heck is sugar dust and why is it combustible? Sugar dust is exactly what it sounds like. It's the tiny particles that come off sugar during the refining process. It's also highly flammable. The most combustible sugar dust comes off during the final stage. Refined sugar moves along conveyor belts for packaging, and those tiny dust particles float into the air. They eventually land and accumulate somewhere, like dust on your bookshelf. As sugar moved through the facility, it spilled and piled up. Meanwhile, clouds of sugar dust hovered near the ceiling. Imagine stepping outside during a snowstorm, but it's sugar dust instead of snow. They had systems to remove the dust, but they were too small and in disrepair. The main explosion occurred underground, below 3 100-foot sugar silos. Sugar would empty out of the silos, slide down a chute, and land on a long conveyor belt. The belt was covered in a steel house that trapped massive amounts of sugar dust inside. It quickly built up to extremely dangerous levels and finally exploded. All it took was one tiny spark from an overheated bearing. The initial blast set off a chain reaction that swept through the building. The explosions cut the power, leaving the workers trapped in a maze of dark, damaged stairways. Nobody had ever conducted an emergency evacuation drill. They tried desperately to escape the fire. Some made it, others didn't. Imperial Sugar was fined by OSHA for safety violations at their Louisiana plant and faced numerous lawsuits after the Port Wentworth disaster. The company rebuilt the Georgia plant and hoped to return to refining sugar by the end of 2008. The USS Thresher was a state-of-the-art nuclear-powered submarine launched on July 9th of 1960. It was the first in a long line of new subs meant to run more quietly and dive significantly deeper. On April 10th of 1963, 16 officers, 96 sailors, and 17 civilians boarded the Thresher to conduct drills off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Tragedy struck during those drills, and the Thresher sank to the seafloor about 300 miles off the coast. The USS Skylark, another ship participating in these drills, received communications from the Thresher around 9:13 a.m. Something was wrong, but nobody knew what was happening. Moments later, the Skylark saw sonar images of the Thresher breaking apart and sinking. So, what happened? An investigation found a leak in the engine room caused the electrical systems to short-circuit. The propulsion systems failed, and the Thresher couldn't bring itself back to the surface. but that was only the official story. A FOIA request in 2020 found that the Navy rushed the Thresher into operation. If we had to guess, it was to keep up with the USSR during the Cold War. The crew didn't have the best training. They were also way too confident in the nuclear systems. In their minds, it could never fail. Improper welding caused a leak in the piping, which fried the electrical system. The undertrained crew never had a chance. The Korean War left South Korea in shambles during the 1950s. Then, the country turned things around over the next 30 years, becoming one of the most technologically advanced places on Earth. Unfortunately, building at such dizzying speeds doesn't come without consequences. Their build now, fix later attitude finally bit them in the mid-90s. On June 29th of 1995, the Sampoong department store in Seoul, South Korea collapsed, claiming 502 lives and injuring over 900 people. It was the largest peacetime disaster in South Korean history. Construction began in 1987 as Seoul prepared to host the 1988 Summer Olympics. The thing is, foreign contractors weren't allowed to take on South Korean building projects. Everything had to be built by domestic companies. Since those companies had so much on their plates, the projects were often rushed. Cutting corners was the industry standard. The Sampoong project went to a company called Woosung Construction. Originally, it was supposed to be a 4-story apartment complex. Then, Lee Jun, head of Sampoong Group, changed gears. After the foundation was already laid, Lee decided he wanted to build a luxury department store instead. He also wanted an ice skating rink on the unplanned 5th floor because why not? All of his demands were against zoning regulations, so Woosung said absolutely not. Lee fired them and hired his own construction company to make his dream come true. The Sampoong department store opened in 1990. 5 years later, it was a pile of rubble. Lee was found guilty of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10 years. He passed away a few months after his release in 2003. The International Nuclear Events Scale, or the INES, measures the severity of any nuclear incident from 0 to 7. It's like the magnitude scale for earthquakes. A 0 means everything is fine. A 7 means everything is not fine. To date, there have only been 2 7s in nuclear history: Chernobyl and the Fukushima nuclear meltdown in Japan. On March 11th of 2011, Japan experienced its strongest earthquake in recorded history. The earthquake sent a tsunami wave racing toward the Japanese coast and the Fukushima nuclear power plant. According to National Geographic, the wave was 132 feet tall in some places. The tsunami that hit the plant was nearly 50 feet tall. It caused a total meltdown at 3 of the 6 reactors, leading to a humanitarian crisis we hadn't seen since Chernobyl. Investigations found that the plant owner and regulator did not install the necessary safety equipment to prevent the plant from flooding. There was also overwhelming evidence that the plant was basically doomed if a tsunami ever struck. Today, the area around the Fukushima plant is a ghost town. Over 160,000 people were forced to drop everything and leave. In 2017, the government deemed it safe enough for about 21,000 people to return. Only 1,000 took the offer. Some estimates say the Japanese government will spend $700 billion over 40 years to bring Fukushima back to the thriving city it once was. On February 3rd of 2023, around 9 p.m., a train owned by Norfolk Southern derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. The train was towing 150 cars, 20 of which contained toxic chemicals. 11 of those toxic cars derailed in the crash, leading to what some call Chernobyl 2.0. 5 of the derailed cars carried vinyl chloride, a toxic substance used to make PVC. Minor exposure can cause shortness of breath and headaches. Chronic exposure to high levels, like those found in a train car, can cause liver damage and cancer, according to the CDC. One of the tankers spilled a bunch of butyl acrylate, a clear liquid used to make adhesives and paint. Exposure can cause headaches, nausea, and irritation to the nose, throat, and lungs. Everyone's main concern was the risk of a catastrophic explosion. One of the derailed cars was getting really hot. If it got too hot, it could set off an explosive chain reaction, sending shrapnel flying up to a mile away. 5,000 people were evacuated within a mile radius of the accident. To avoid the explosion, authorities breached 5 tankers of vinyl chloride, allowing the toxic gas to plume into the air. To top it off, they also set the chemicals on fire as a way to eliminate them. Was this the most effective method? Well, perhaps, but it also created a massive plume of toxic smoke that traveled over much of the Northeast. But what caused the train to derail in the first place? The answer might be everyone's favorite: corporate greed. According to the Lever, Norfolk Southern played a part in killing a new federal safety rule that would require them to upgrade the braking systems on their trains. These braking systems apparently haven't changed since the Civil War. As of right now, the cause is attributed to an overheated wheel bearing, but a full investigation has not been completed. The Tom Sauk Hydroelectric Power Station was built between 1960 and 1962. It's about 90 miles south of St. Louis, Missouri, and sits behind Johnson's Shut-In State Park. The plant featured an upper reservoir on Prophet Mountain that held over 5 million cubic meters of water. That's enough to fill more than 2,000 Olympic swimming pools. However, the Tom Sauk blueprint didn't include one crucial feature: a spillway. On December 14th of 2005, that oversight came back to bite them. The upper reservoir overflowed, causing 1.5 billion gallons of water to race down Prophet Mountain and flood Johnson's Park. The only people in the park were Superintendent Jerry Troops, his wife, and his children. They thought they'd be safe in their home. They were wrong. The flash flood was so powerful that it ripped the house clean from its foundation. The family was washed across the road and into a field. First responders found them later on. They were soaking wet and covered in debris. The Ameren Corporation, which oversees the dam, took full responsibility. They said the overflow occurred because monitoring equipment was improperly maintained. They were on the hook for $180 million in property damages. An independent investigation determined the entire thing could have been avoided if they had included a spillway in the original plans. Ameren made sure to include one upon repairing the plant. On October 19th of 1991, firefighters in Oakland, California responded to a fire at 7151 Buckingham Boulevard. Tensions ran high as the area was highly susceptible to forest fires. If they didn't get this fire under control soon, it could be a complete catastrophe. The firefighters thought they had smothered the final flame. They didn't notice the smoldering pine needles in the nearby trees. The next morning, changing winds blew those hot needles in every direction. Within an hour, 800 homes were already on fire. The extremely dry area offered the perfect conditions for the firestorm to spread. In some places, temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Fighting it was impossible. Many homes were built on steep hillsides with narrow streets. Firefighters struggled to get their trucks close enough. By the time they did, it was too late. It only took about 10 minutes for a home with wooden shingles to burn down. By the time the fire was finally contained, it had claimed 25 lives and injured 150 others. The firestorm destroyed 3,000 homes and 1,500 acres of land. All tallied up, the damage exceeded $1.5 billion. Will Wright, the founder of Maxis Games, was one of the first to lose his home to the fire. He escaped with his family and rebuilt his life piece by piece. The rebuild inspired him to create one of the best-selling computer games of all time, The Sims. Well, that's all we have for you today. To see another video just like this one, be sure to click the link on screen now. And with that, thanks for watching and tune in next time.